Again, thank you, Amina, for inviting me to moderate this panel. I think what I want to sort of start with is to bring back the whole discussion into the context of HBKU or Education City itself, and maybe start with Kelly and but your experience in sort of starting up the minor in architecture here at Education City through Carnegie Mellon, and the sort of reason for you to bring in such a program into Education City, the need for it, and although Virginia Commonwealth exists here with a very strong design, interior design, and fashion program, we still see a sort of gap in the sort of architectural education, but I think that filled up a very major role. If you can tell us more about the program.
Sure. So I think can everybody hear me? I think when Rami and I came here in our first visit, maybe it was in 2005 or 2006, we actually came from Dubai, and which is important to say, and came to a really sleepy town of Doha. We always say that, Doha is about 10 years behind Dubai. I don't know if you agree, George. It's catching up, yes, in good and bad ways. And when we came, we started by teaching a few electives, and we brought a group of Pittsburgh architecture students from the home campus with us for a study abroad program. And I think that those 5 years that we brought students back and forth, the students came with us, they served as teaching assistants to the local students in the electives that we taught. I think that those 5 years were probably the most fulfilling years of our lives. Because we saw the city through their eyes, and cities through their eyes. At the time, we traveled widely. We went on 3 regional trips a year, so we visited many of the cities that have been discussed, and our students visited them often without us, which was a great thing, our students from the States. And teaching the local students here has been incredibly fulfilling in that of course, their city has transformed before their eyes, and they're not just Qatari students, but students from all over the region, from Southeast Asia, from the greater Middle East, and they're students taking many different majors, and I hope that with their architectural education, they're able to bring something to the careers that they're now engaged in, and I'm sure they can. I think that not only can they see great physical change, but they experience much of the informalness of the city and opened our eyes to that, what happens in those back streets. If I would have had another 5 minutes, I would have talked about not just streets or mega projects, but streets and spaces, because these things, these kind of informal networks that were discussed are so important to the city. And I think that they certainly opened our eyes to that, and we perhaps opened their eyes to the greater physical manifestation of the city.
And I think by meeting some of those students and also by attending some of the reviews that you did hold here at Carnegie Mellon, it was interesting to see that this sort of architectural research, architectural archiving, documentation of such spaces in the city and such places in the city sort of exited the realm of a studio or an architectural program per se, and it sort of went through to students of computer sciences, students of business, and students of economics, and so on. And by seeing how they've continued to think about these sort of outcomes of the courses, it just sort of leads one to see how all of this research can actually be used and utilized in the realm sort of outside the architecture profession itself. And that is another question that I have with all the research that was done by students at AUS, students at Columbia, the work that's being done in Amman. How do you see that, I mean, this question goes to all really, how do you see that all of the outcomes and all of the sort of results of these studies and surveys would translate into the betterment, like you said, of architecture, of urban design itself, and of sort of shaping the evolution of the cities?
So I imagine you're referring to the Collecting Architecture Territories,
Yes,
to the Echoing Borders project. I'm too used to saying collecting. And Mark is here, so there's that. We've been asking ourselves that question over and over again. So Nina and I are developing these kind of mapping or scanning techniques in order to be able to capture the transformations that are very elusive and that happen in very short spans of time and in very localized and materially, only materially visible in many cases. So this is a sort of, we see it first and foremost as a documentation, but as a documentation of something that's happening on the ground, but that's also shaping the lives and the futures of people in a massive scale. So taking that forward, we also have been seeing that through the understanding of the materiality of the process of how that space is changed. So if, for example, a trench of sand is being slowly transformed into a formal border crossing, by kind of looking at these arrestations of time, like the project that Sisi Shen was working on, it was then possible to start thinking of alternative scenarios. And I think that's where the speculative would come in if the project were to go that route, but in understanding of processes rather than seeing territories or places as kind of already settled or already understandable spaces as they are or as conditions. I think the idea of understanding and mapping a process for us has been very powerful in the kind of creating an alternative imaginary of that same space, because of the gaps that exist between each arrestation and each moment of scanning.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. And Professor George, you want to sort of add on that?
But I think also with these recent projects that also Noura and Kelly, I had the opportunity to visit some of the work that Kelly and Rami did over here, and also we work with Noura, taking our students and making them work, encourage them to work in teams with students from Colombia, for example, which means from the rest of the world to some extent. And it was really interesting for our students, who were mainly locals, to see how other students were so much interested about the local condition. And not only the refugee and the camps, which was a very special project, but other groups of students we have from Europe and the US visiting the Gulf and really being very curious about what's going on. And that's an absolute amazing, I think, experience, good experience for our students who, there's a tendency here to look to Europe or the West as the ultimate. In fact, we structure our curriculum according to the American, if you like, system. But we also want to make sure that we appreciate and we work within the local condition. And by having these exchanges of students, it's one of the best learning experiences that other students are interested in the Middle East as much as we're interested in the rest of the world. And in a way, coming back to the education city here, which admittedly is a very architecturally beautiful space in terms of its concept and its implementation. It shows that there's a lot of talent, and even though most of the buildings were maybe not done by local architects, but there is incredible possibilities here to educate students in this environment as well. So at the end of the day, there's a local high quality of talent here, and there are a lot of challenges and inspirations, environmental, social, and so on, that I think are very, very important.
I mean, What I see Education City sort of offering in Doha is another sort of generation of, as you said, beautifully designed and very remarkable buildings that one can learn from, be this person an architect or not. And the question I have about sort of, and maybe this can go out to questions from the audience as well, because of the time, is sort of, how do I pose this question? How can, although it being a satellite, sort of another gated mega project in the city, not within the sort of municipality of Doha, but within Rayan even, how can this sort of, how do you see that this sort of exchange of knowledge, exchange of expertise and so on can be sort of translated throughout the city?
Maybe, do you want to respond to this?
I'm not sure I'm the person to talk about, but I'll respond to the previous one, yeah. I think the answer to that question is actually in the text that Nora cited by Edward Said. And it has something to do with the defense postures of the institution and the university, and also exactly what Derrida was claiming when he said that what one has to examine is the protective diaphragms of the university. I think probably there's an answer there. But to come back to your previous question about collecting architecture territories, I think in part it's a tool to allow students and to compel faculty and the institution to look at new sites and conditions. It has an absurdly pretentious premise, which is that somehow looking at the formation of a certain type of cultural institution, something like new cultural logic can become visible. And that was a polemic that started the project. And the hope was that some knowledge would come of it. But there wasn't ever an expectation that anything like amelioration would come from it or some form of betterment in an urban civic sense, but only betterment in, let's say, I don't know, a kind of research intellectual sense. There was an idea that looking at these sites within cultural institutions, but also within other sites of collecting more broadly, like some of the ones I showed, that you could potentially increase architecture's intelligence and capacities in relationship to new social, political, economic formations. And that's the impulse in a sense. But the surprising thing is that that project, which was intended to last for only 1 year, keeps going because the ridiculously pretentious premise that somehow the emergence of these new institutions would show us something of the complex formations of aesthetics and capital in the world turned out to be partly true, that, you know, as we pulled on that thread, more and more became exposed. And so that's also how it has helped, I think. It's helped us ask what types of questions need to be asked through architecture such that it can operate in the world with different types of efficacies. But I would just say again that maybe that's a form of improvement, but I don't see a direct objective instrumental relationship to design as an improving discipline though, but design as a kind of analytical practice, as a set of exposures, I think it works that way.
And if we can take a couple of questions from the audience. One question. Yeah, Dr. Ali.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentations. Thank you so much. I'm honored to hear that. I have a comment for Kelly and a question for Nora. And my comment is related to your narrative of the 4 main phases of development in Qatar, moving from pearls to oil to gas and then to real estate. I just came back from Abu Dhabi. I was giving a lecture at the American University, at the New York University in Abu Dhabi, and the lecture titled, Doha is not Dubai. And my position in the lecture was a bit opposing what you're saying, because if we would agree with your narrative, it means actually that Doha is not developing. It's actually going back. And our even presence at Education City today, and also the Qatar National Development Framework and Qatar National Vision 2030, which is suggesting that knowledge economy is going to be the backbone of the development of the country and its cities. And also the presence of different universities, research centers, museums, and all the different tools and catalysts for establishing a sort of a new paradigm based on knowledge and creativity as opposed to real estate, is suggesting maybe that we need to revisit this final chapter of your narrative. And for Nora, again, very exciting presentation, and I like very much the lecture of Edward Said. I almost look at it on a daily basis, because I've been teaching in the Gulf for the last 12 years, and one of my fundamental questions was related to the demographic structure of the staff. Most of the staff are expatriates, and they would come up with the agenda that we are here as a sort of outsiders. We leave the place. We're not connected to the place. And therefore, having a political agenda, using their identity as a sort of a catalyst of change is not always their priority. So how do you feel about that? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start. I'm glad you challenged that, Ali, because, so first of all, I borrowed that narrative from Associate Professor Khalid Adham from UAE University. In the book, The Evolving Arab City, he put those 4 economic drivers forward. And actually, real estate, I think, is not necessarily an economic driver, but a byproduct of gas in Qatar. And I think something that's really important is obviously what happens after a hydrocarbon-based economy, and it is a knowledge-based economy and culture. And I think that Qatar Foundation and Qatar Museums are at the forefront of that here in Doha. And you know, when I raised those sort of critical questions at the end of the talk, you can already see, I tried to sort of answer some of those in the way that initiatives are being forwarded currently. And yeah, we'll see what the future holds.
Thank you for your question. I wouldn't be able to respond in a informed way about Doha, but I would, in an attempt to start responding to your question, I would probably start looking at the structural impossibilities that exist for any kind of political agenda. I don't think it's a question of priority. I think it's more a question of channeling or the space given or not given to forms of movement or those political agendas that you're referring to emerge. Even if we go back and start looking into the curriculum of the school, the curriculum of the university, and what, you know, the inclusions and exclusions that exist structurally within that. I think that's probably kind of going back to the text of Said. It's an essential part of the reason for whether or not people can begin to feel a sort of sense of ownership and belonging to a place.
No, I think, Ali, back to your point, you raised 2 issues, and I think that there's a certain negation in those 2. And one, you say on the one hand that there's this whole knowledge economy discourse, which I think is impacting the entire Gulf. It's a sort of, I see it in the same way as, well, every nation state has to have its own national airline that competes globally. This kind of knowledge economy discourse is extremely pervasive today. And I think it's, one, highly suspect in some ways. And I think just for the very reason, it goes to your second point about this, let's say, national expatriate dynamic and the potential of a knowledge economy within the context of this national expatriate dynamic. And how is that going to play itself out? because I think it has to do with questions of vested interests in place. And how does one become vested as an expatriate? Because I think it's that within that investment, let's say beyond the economic, it's a personal investment to become vested in a place that is a contribution to an economy and to the building of knowledge within that economy. And so I think you've raised some important questions, but I think in some senses the two are connected. And you probably can't have one without addressing the kind of difficulties and challenges inherent and embedded within the other.
Thank you very much. We'll be taking a 5-minute break, very short break, and right after we'll be learning more about, or we'll be hearing more about learning and the city from the region and from the Gulf. Thank you.